So I'm going to begin shortly. Jason, if you're on, would you kindly start recording?
It is recording.
Thanks, Jason. All right. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Karen Nelson. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture at the Boston Architectural College, which has been recognized with distinction for its leadership in educating an extraordinarily diverse student body to help bring about social equity through design. It's my pleasure to introduce the BAC's final event in the student-sponsored lecture series of Fall 2020 Just Space, which is now supported by Eastern Bank. I first heard the term Just Space from Cephas when he participated in a symposium at the BAC in 2018 called Black Spaces Matter. Cephas holds a PhD in History of Architecture and Urban Planning from Harvard University and a Master of Architecture from the University of Detroit Mercy. Jay's work explores the history and theory of urbanism from 1800 to the present, with a focus on urban design, preservation planning, technology, and social and spatial justice. In 2015, Jay was awarded a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Michigan's Society of Fellows, and Jay taught previously at Harvard, Northeastern, University of Detroit Mercy, and Cranbrook, and is currently completing a book, Fordism and the City, How an Industrial Aesthetic Shaped the Urban Imaginary. Jay is now an assistant professor at Northeastern University in Architecture and Urbanism, and most recently, he was awarded the extraordinarily distinguished Graham Foundation grant to support the Black Architects Archive.
What are you watching?
The Black Architects Archive is a web-based interactive repository of architectural practices that map the genealogy of Black architects from the 1950s to the present. The archive collects and displays the work of Black architects across history in an effort to bring to light underrepresented practitioners in architecture. By bringing underrepresented architects to light, the Black Architects Archive helps to change the kinds of research into architectural history that's done, and thus serves as an important resource for diversifying the curriculum within architectural education. Jay is also the founding director of Studio Platt, a Boston-based geospatial research and development practice that develops products and systems to maximize social impact design and planning while helping mission-driven organizations build greater capacity. Tonight, Jay will present Authentically You, Histories of Navigating Race and Identity in Data Landscapes. In this project, Cephas develops a theory of urban data analysis that places W.E.B. Du Bois's demographic maps and data diagrams as the historical progenitor of contemporary big data. Here, Dr. Cephas is interested in how Du Bois uses diagrams to shift discourses of Blackness away from Black bodies and towards Black neighborhoods. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Cephas.
Thank you.
Jay, would you share your screen?
Yep, that's what I'm doing.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you to Karen for inviting me and to everyone else involved with organizing this event. I'm very pleased to be here to discuss some of my work, but first I will begin by situating myself. I'm speaking to you from my home, which is located within the unceded land of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts peoples, the Neponset village specifically, a stretch of land just north of the Neponset River, west of the Massachusetts Bay. This community within which I live, which we now call Dorchester, was founded upon measures of exclusion, erasure, and violence. And similar measures of exclusion, erasure, and violence forced my own ancestors to this continent long ago and have made my presence here possible. And still yet, similar measures of exclusion, erasure, and violence continue to shape the community within which I live, as well as other communities within these unceded territories. Acknowledging the land and territories from which I speak to you today serves to bring to the forefront the legacies of dispossession that are foundational to the histories of both the land and the people of the United States. In addition to the colonization of land and people, the colonization of knowledge has been instrumental to shaping the histories of this country. Accordingly, my purpose in this talk today is to call into question the chains of knowledge that shape our present moments, especially the chains of knowledge that have served to construct notions of race and identity in our past and presents. Sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois famously noted back in 1903 that the central issue of the 20th century would be the question of the color line. While on the surface, Du Bois was clearly referring to the figurative place of race in the collective imagination, it's helpful to take his statement about the color line literally to think about the spatialization of race. Race and its various expressions through culture, legislation, and social mores has been historically enacted and regulated through physical lines drawn in space. In many ways, the history of racial discrimination and anti-Black sentiments in the United States can be reduced to the prohibitions, both implicit and explicit, of Black bodies in public spaces. The rallying cry of Black Lives Matter and now Black Spaces Matter make explicit what most of us have known, if only intuitively, for centuries, and that is that social differences, perceived or real, are instituted through spatial differences. When African Americans were restricted from the common public places and institutions earlier in this country's history, the private homes of Black Americans and the Black institutions created by Black Americans became places of freedom, sanctuary, and resistance. These Black publics mattered intensely for African Americans from the moment the first enslaved Africans were brought to this continent. Yet notions of Black space were antithetical to 19th century academic understandings of home, public space, and common institutions. Even though African Americans in the early Americas constituted a significant portion of the overall population, spatial studies, whether in architecture, urban planning, geography, or sociology, took whiteness as a default backdrop to understanding cities and the places in which people lived. This habit of positioning whiteness as a default, that is, of positioning spatial practices of varying people as inherently a subset of white ways of engaging with environments, whether built or natural, this habit still remains with us today. As a budding sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois pushed back against this academic erasure of the Black experience. He instead dedicated the first part of his career to reconstructing the study of Black life in the United States. As a counter to previous academic studies that pathologized Blackness through pseudoscientific and often invasive studies of Black bodies, Du Bois sought to humanize, categorize, and most importantly, understand Black social space through the study of Black communities. In this, he resisted the notion that Black personhood was a problem by instead problematizing cities and urban living at the turn of the 20th century. So as I mentioned, Du Bois is perhaps most well known for his prescient assertion in 1903 that the main problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. Du Bois's statement about the color line has largely been interpreted as a general commentary concerning the role race would play within modern society at the dawn of the new century. However, Du Bois's own place within intellectual history has been affected by the color line as well. His recognition as a scholar has been largely confined to his work on race and social activism in African American history, despite significant contributions he made to the field of urban sociology and the general study of cities. While Du Bois's 1899 study of African Americans in Philadelphia demonstrated one of the earliest uses of demographic mapping as a visual and analytical tool in the academic study of cities, the introduction of data mapping and visualization as a means for studying urban environments has instead often been attributed to the scholars belonging to the Chicago School of Sociology that rose to prominence in the 1920s and 30s. So the purpose of this project, this work that I've been engaging in lately, is to construct an intellectual history of urban data analysis that routes the origins of modern city mapping and data visualization in the 19th century and through Du Bois's studies of turn of the century Black urban life. Beyond simply including Du Bois within the historical canon of urban data analysis and visualization, I seek to recognize his studies of Black urban life as foundational for how we do or how we should analyze, visualize, and understand cities today. I also
Hi,
use his
Jay.
approach to,
Sorry to interrupt. I don't think anyone can see the screen. Are you sharing
Yes,
your screen?
I haven't switched the slides yet. I am sharing the screen,
Okay,
and
so
it's just a
we're
white
supposed to
screen.
see just white?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure because people are messaging in the chat. So
Nope, no
okay.
problem.
Keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
It's about to change. I also use Du Bois's approach to mapping people and places to critique our current methods of urban data analysis and to offer some new insights on thinking through urban data mapping. So prior to Du Bois's studies, earlier in the 19th century, photography served as a primary means to capture and study the natural world. Having for the first time the ability to capture reality in a fixed format, the photograph was understood to be a direct and unmitigated reflection of things as they were. And thus the photograph was positioned as a kind of scientific document of the natural world. Quickly, photography became a tool for studying human bodies. In 1850, the Swiss-American zoologist Louis Agassiz commissioned a series of photographs of enslaved Africans as part of a study he wished to conduct. For Agassiz, these photographs were seen to be a primary source of information about the people they depicted and also about how the quote unquote race and culture that these enslaved Africans represented. Already adhering to the belief that humankind consisted of several distinct species, of which he believed some to be more socially advanced than others, Agassiz used the photographs as evidence of his assertions. The subjects of the photographs, enslaved Africans stripped naked and humiliated before the lens of the camera, served as proof to Agassiz, along with dozens of other photographs taken, that there was some inherent truth regarding their alleged inferiority that could be found in the shapes of their heads, the curves of their lips, or the profile of their postures. In writing of the history of photography and shaping social identities, Alan Sakuda noted how the study of bodies grounded pseudoscientific knowledge that was parlayed as and merged with truth in the 19th century. Researchers like the Parisian police officer Alphonse Bottillon saw in photography the opportunity to record human data in the hopes of gleaning some deeper information in the physical appearances of people that could reveal aspects of their personality or of their culture. Bertillon pursued the collection of biometric data that could uniquely identify a single individual. And in so doing, he became fixated on this idea that the profile and the frontal images of a face could serve as the basis for conducting biometric analyses, which would in turn yield unique identifying features for each individual. Deriving biometric data from photographs wasn't limited to human faces, though. Side-by-side photographs of body parts as diverse as arms, legs, and even ears were errantly believed to prove not just diversity of forms within the species, but uniqueness of certain features to each individual. Such biometric analyses were used to draw broad generalizations across entire groups of people, and indeed, they served as the foundation of constructing modern ideas about race. Sekula referred to this racialization of groups through biometric study as a campaign of inscription. That is, it reflected an effort to make a text of the physical features of the body that could then be read in photographs. These studies had real practical implications. Agassiz was a leading natural scientist during his time, and his studies both supported and furthered beliefs in racialized science that contributed to broader social issues, such as the 1857 Supreme Court Dred Scott decision that determined that African Americans deemed less than human had no right to citizenship. Bertillon's studies led him to invent the mugshot, which became a widespread method for both uniquely documenting and uniquely identifying criminals. And Francis Galton, another researcher using the photograph to study human character, went on to invent fingerprints as a method of identification. Through this work, photographs themselves came to be seen as a literal image of scientific truth, while the bodies depicted in them were treated as repositories of data holding that truth. These photographs and their resultant images of racialization reflected what anthropologist Michael Blakey has referred to as a biodeterministic imagination, or a broader belief in the determining possibilities of physical attributes, despite a lack of scientific evidence actually supporting such ideas. So this is the context within which W.E.B. Du Bois was working. These approaches, specifically the use of photographs to document and analyze the bodies of individuals in attempts to draw broad generalizations about large populations of people, reflected a widespread and accepted method for scientifically studying populations of people. While Du Bois himself was not completely immune to the pulls of this racialized scientific determinism, at points himself he questioned whether African Americans could benefit from quote unquote purity within racial type. He did, however, recognize the fundamental falsehoods inherent to such pseudoscientific studies, and instead he saw theories and methods to counter them. First and foremost, Du Bois sought to move away from studying the individual physical body and instead focus on the collective social body, which meant shifting the research focus away from bodies to turn instead towards space. And he did this by turning to maps. While Du Bois pioneered the use of maps in the social studies of cities, maps had long been used to understand and organize urban and rural space. Cadastral maps had already been used for centuries to show property lines and ownership, and they were indeed a fundamental tool of order during the expansion of colonialism. But like the photographs of the 19th century, maps were also seen as a kind of direct representation of reality, despite the ways in which they abstracted the forms of life that they served to represent. The earliest known use of urban mapping as a form of data analysis has been attributed to John Snow's mapping of London's cholera epidemic in 1854. Snow's cholera map was distinguished from earlier cadastral maps and demographic maps in that the purpose of the map was not to represent what was already known, but to glean new unknown information from the mapping of known information. This mapping of the known to reveal the unknown is what's key to modern demographic mapping. But Snow's map reflects a one-to-one relation. That is, it tells us exactly one piece of information, who died from cholera, and it maps that information to a specific location. We don't know anything else. We don't know the age or identity of the victim or when they got sick. The map simply tells us that something happened to someone in a specific location without giving us any further data or means for analysis. Population dot maps, such as John Snow's cholera map, were helpful in marking population distribution, but they didn't yield any additional information about that population. Du Bois expanded upon the utility of the population dot map by embedding a range of demographic information within the map itself. In 1896, he set out with a group of graduate students from the University of Pennsylvania on a project to comprehensively map the people of Philadelphia's 7th Ward. He and the students went door to door to survey every household in the district, which stretched from Spruce Street south to South Street and from 5th Street to the Schuylkill River. Beyond classifying the race of each member of each household, Du Bois's team segmented the population by class, age, gender, income, and profession. While the study itself had originally been funded to demonstrate the pathology inherent to Black urban neighborhoods, Du Bois used his data analysis of Philadelphia's Black ward to demonstrate quite the opposite. Du Bois published his data in a 500-page volume titled The Philadelphia Negro. Filled with an array of maps and data charts, the Philadelphia Negro showed not just where African Americans lived in Philadelphia, but how they lived and who they lived with and alongside. The maps revealed neighborhoods that were racially segregated to a degree, but also highly economically diverse. Doctors and lawyers lived adjacent to trade workers and domestics. And while some blocks were entirely Black, many were interspersed with Black and white households. Du Bois's study of Philadelphia illuminated for the first time what life was really like for Black people living in cities at the turn of the 20th century. Diverging from earlier population dot maps, Du Bois instead mapped the built environment itself, showing each block of the ward and the individual buildings occupying those blocks. He used a color scale to mark the social identities under study, whether identities of race, income, or profession. Then he marked the map with those colors to give a spatial context for the demographic information under study. The result was a map that revealed information about people and places rather than simply visualizing things that were already known. New information included the fact that these so-called Black ghettos were more racially and economically diverse than previously believed. The maps also allowed for more nuanced readings of the urban condition, and the possibility for understanding shifts in demography across the neighborhood. Ultimately, Du Bois's project served to make Black life visible in the study of cities, while also visually challenging prevailing ideas about Black life in those cities. In 1900, just after publishing The Philadelphia Negro, Du Bois created a series of maps and diagrams that attempted to apply the same methodology executed in The Philadelphia Negro to the entire state of Georgia. Du Bois's renderings showed not just the state of Black life in Georgia, but the conditions of Black space in Georgia compared to majority white space. His dot map of the 2,500 African Americans living in Dougherty County used color to show the range of economic classes in this area, from the well-to-do and better off to the poor and the lowest classes. He used a dot map here to show us not just where the various social classes lived in the neighborhood, but how they were distributed on each block. His Wintosh County map showed clusters of classes, same as in the previous map of 3,000 African Americans. This map showed the distribution in relation to the natural geography rather than to property plat lines, a relationship that is much more helpful to see considering that these were largely agrarian communities. And then its map showing the distribution of 1,000 African Americans in McIntosh County, Georgia, showed this even distribution across the town of Darien. And so with these kinds of maps, it prompts questions rather than simply telling us things that we don't know. And so it prompts the question here of what this might begin to tell us about Black people living in this county. Du Bois extended the study of African Americans in Georgia to cover the entire state. And then he eventually moved up to the scale of the entire country to position Georgia in relation to the rest of the nation, but also to understand the distribution of race across the country. Du Bois's maps of Philadelphia and Georgia were attempts to fully understand and in every way what it meant to live in Black space in the early 19th century. Visual documentation was key to this endeavor as it allowed the direct communication of nuances that otherwise would be lost in the research. Additionally, using maps and diagrams meant quantifying the spatial information for specific kinds of in-depth analyses while still being able to draw qualitative conclusions. Following the completion of the Georgia Negro project, Du Bois looked to put his study of Black American life into a global context. He submitted the Georgia Negro to the 1903 Paris Exposition, and in preparation for this exhibition, he also created dozens of new diagrams to expand upon the previous information that he had compiled. For Du Bois, going global meant making global comparisons. And so here he showed the population of Black Americans compared to the total population of European nations. So this diagram not only situates the population of Black America in relation to these other nations, but the comparison alone suggests that Black America itself was a nation. And so this is one of the many ways in which Du Bois both challenged and elevated the status of Black Americans through these kinds of visual analyses and comparisons. Then he takes this approach a step further by positioning the population of Black people in the United States in relation to the rest of the country. And in doing this shows that the African American population as a fraction of the larger US population wasn't shrinking, but rather that the white population was growing rapidly due in part to increased immigration from Europe. And so this constitutes a kind of visual argument against the notion that African Americans were a numerical threat to white society and culture. To continue this global comparison, Du Bois placed African American literacy in comparison to the literacy of various European nations to tell a different story about African American education. The use of a simple bar chart with a splash of color clearly highlights that Black Americans in 1903 had a similar rate of literacy as Hungarians, for example, but a far higher literacy rate than either France or Ireland. In this visualization of the valuation of property owned by Black people following the Civil War, Du Bois used a simple line graph with text to great effect. The chart shows the rise of Black property values, despite the sustained violence being levied against Black communities due to lynching. But with the rise of disenfranchisement during the late Reconstruction period, the values begin to fall, likely due to increased restrictions against the Black ownership of property. Another simple line graph demonstrates what the earlier comparison map showed, that the African American population had largely plateaued over the decades, with only slight growth during the Industrial Revolution, while the white population continued to grow exponentially. So over the course of these diagrams, a narrative emerges. This means that these maps and diagrams were not just presenting raw data and facts about people, but rather they strove to articulate a more comprehensive and cohesive argument by putting these data into context. And part of that context relied on making comparisons rooted in understanding Black people in relation to the rest of the nation and to the world. And most importantly, simply making this comparison also meant presuming an equality between these people. A surprising simplicity and clarity really persists throughout many of these diagrams, while they also reflect novel approaches to displaying data. So this one being shown here is actually one of my favorites, and it shows the relative numbers of Black people living in cities, that's the green line, Black people living in suburbs, which is shown in yellow, and Black people living in rural areas, which is shown in red. So despite the flux of Blacks to the north following Reconstruction and the growing industrial infrastructure of the United States, the majority continued to live in rural areas. So in part, Du Bois is visually demonstrating how the shift of blame to African Americans for the decline of cities, which took hold in the last decades of the 19th century, was largely unfounded. I really appreciate the relational aspect of this diagram and how it serves to make visible the relatively invisible presence of Black spatial practices in histories of American urban and rural environments. His use of the curve is instrumental here. The looping of the rural population wound tight like a spring demonstrates a keen attention to the space of the page itself. This is a design move, and this design move serves to focus attention on that spring, which is the main body of information that Du Bois aimed to highlight here. Du Bois often used the curve to dramatize the difference in numbers. Here, he's showing that despite the fact that most African Americans lived in rural areas, most African Americans who were enrolled in a course of study were actually focusing on industrial subjects. The curve enters again to show that the majority remained in agricultural work. So coupled with the large number studying industrial subjects, we can surmise that many were looking to move away from agricultural work. So this is an example of the narrative that began to emerge across the pages of these visual diagrams. The curve appears again, dramatizing the effects of the data. As Du Bois showed here, as time goes on, Black people began to accrue things of greater monetary value. Yet this diagram shows that although the total value of property held by Black Americans had risen over the years, fewer and fewer people were property holders. And some reasoning for this fact was reflected in the fact that the United States in 1903 remained a largely agricultural nation with few employment opportunities outside of farming and domestic work for Black people compared to whites. And this modified pie chart lets us make those direct comparisons between the two populations of people. Lest we be confused, Du Bois shows us similar information, but using a different form of visualization. Here we see the proportional relationship between the occupations held by whites and Blacks separately. This visualization makes clear how many more white people were employed in all forms of labor in the United States, while at the same time showing how few Black people were employed in forms of labor outside of agriculture and in domestic work. For Du Bois, these diagrams serve to reveal new information about Black people in the United States precisely by pushing back against prevailing and errant beliefs. Here, he used a pie diagram in a novel way to illustrate the occurrence of pauperism among Black Americans. So the large brown half circle represented 100,000 Black Americans, while the tiny red circle at the bottom center of it represented the number of paupers. That is, the people who would receive public service due to poverty or incapacitation. So that was the number out of 100,000. So the number is really small, 86 people out of every 100,000 people, with slightly more men than women receiving this aid. And so this diagram pushes back against the belief that African Americans strained public services due to over-reliance on those services. Furthermore, it even suggests that given the number of African Americans living in poverty, that African Americans were actually underserved by government services. While some of Du Bois's diagrams were creative reworkings of existing visualization types, others simply defied categorization. This visualization shows the relative numbers of enslaved Africans versus free African Americans, and it does so by contrasting the sort of dark, jagged line of slavery with the crisp red line of freedom. With these maps and diagrams, Du Bois aimed to convey a full and comprehensive picture of Black life. The series comprised of rigorous and variable statistical data presented humanistically. When photographs do appear, they serve to reinforce the humanity of the subjects rather than treating people as objects. And it was all presented with a keen eye for design that both clarified the meaning behind the data while giving balance, order, and form to the information presented. So I began this talk by acknowledging unceded land and territories. And so now I will move towards conclusion of this talk by acknowledging unceded knowledge. Du Bois pioneered two important ways of studying the conjunction between social life and spatial conditions in cities. First, he deployed demographic mapping, a new methodology that visualized the conditions of urban spaces by overlaying blocks and neighborhoods with relevant data about the people who live there. Second, he generalized the data from his studies into visual forms that could easily communicate the wealth of information gleaned from these analyses. So I would like to claim W.E.B. Du Bois as an ancestor, not as a personal, familial ancestor, but as an intellectual ancestor. For me, as a scholar interested in race and Black epistemologies, but also for all of us who study urban places. More than a century ago, Du Bois introduced this demographic mapping as a framework for studying social life in urban places, and now it is time to acknowledge his role in allowing us to visualize and document cities and the people who live in them. Du Bois's use of mapping had several specific purposes: to be more objective than prevailing studies of Black people, to counter those studies, which mostly sought justifications for racism, to counter them with facts, and to illustrate the great diversity of Black life in the United States. The Philadelphia Negro then was not just a comprehensive survey, but it was testing a new framework for knowledge. Du Bois deployed those maps as analytical tools in conjunction with urban data diagrams to shift academic discourses on race away from previous focuses on Black bodies to instead interrogate the social body of Black communities. In this way, Du Bois's maps and visualizations humanize through abstraction and individualize through generalization. Such strategies reveal how urban data analysis is not a neutral form of communication, but rather it's a historically contingent mode of analysis that's been deployed to both reveal and conceal aspects of urban life. These strategies are crucial to rescue contemporary urban maps and data projects from the trap that held photography in the 19th century. That is, the belief that these visualizations reveal some incontestable and embedded truth. Instead, when the lines scoring a map that represent buildings, streets, and infrastructure function to validate the social data inscribed within them, we must ask ourselves, what serves as a frame of validation for the forms of the city? How is the map working to validate or invalidate the social data it is showing us? We live in an unambiguously dataist present. That is, our present moment believes in the data embedded in maps with the same blind drive that 19th century scholars believed in the data embedded in photographs. Instead, we need to break maps and data visualization away from these biodeterministic imaginations. One way to do that is to recall a method set forth by the late sociologist Stuart Hall, who urged a return to roots by way of tracing routes. This means creating mappings rather than maps that can show us not just the way things are, but how we got there and how things have changed. To that end, I began creating a map of the Great Migration that uses historical census data to show the population counts in every county across the United States. Beginning with 1790, the year of the first decennial census, we can see that the Black population of the US, largely a slave population, was concentrated heavily, not just in the South generally, but more specifically in coastal Virginia and the southern coast of South Carolina. The white areas on the map are places with no African American population or no data available. Over the course of decades, we see the numbers and concentrations of African Americans begin to grow, get more dense within the South. Then they plateau just after the Civil War. By 1890, the number of African Americans in southern counties begins to drop, and by 1930, the counties containing the largest industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia begin to see growth in the African American population. This growth continues through to 2000, when the African American population plateaus again between 2000 and 2010. So I use this interactive map to do several things. First, to convey not just how African Americans were in the US in the 19th century, but seriously, how Black the country was. These maps show the relative numbers of African Americans by percentage of population. In Virginia and South Carolina, most counties had a greater number of Black people than white people. In some counties, African Americans were upwards of 60% or 70% of the population, much greater concentrations than exist today, actually. If we compare this to the counties surrounding Boston, for instance, where African Americans were less than 2% of the population throughout the 19th and into the first half of the 20th century, we can surmise that very different narratives about race, space, and certainly things like integration and segregation existed in these places. Charleston, South Carolina, for example, was very much a Black city in the 18th and 19th century. This kind of mapping can prompt questions relating routes to roots. What did it mean to have an important port city like Charleston populated predominantly by enslaved Africans? How might we think and think through urbanism and the history of urbanism in that context? I'm asking similar broad social questions in a more recent project that maps climate change events in relation to urban form and demographic data. The key question here is, who is the face of climate change? And here I'm seeking to understand direct relationships between changing demographic populations and the effects that climate change events have on urban environments. So through these projects, my own as well as the projects of others that I see, are all attempts to give Black space and its associated Black life a verified presence in the study of urban areas. W.E.B. Du Bois deployed the map and the diagram as analytic objects of an academic racial resistance that he used to shift this academic inquiry away from the physical bodies of Black people and towards the social context of Black communities. So as I've noted, earlier studies of African American life focused almost entirely on the bodies of individuals as a means of extracting specific data that could then be generalized across entire populations. These studies relied heavily on photography to document the bodies of African Americans and other racial minorities in order to study bodily attributes that could then be deemed as significantly influencing certain social or cultural attributes. In contrast, Du Bois used the map and the diagram to humanize the study of African American life, in part by turning his focus towards the spaces in which social life occurred, and also by using principles of visual design to communicate the information he gathered in his research. In doing this, Du Bois revealed new information about a population that, while overstudied, remained misunderstood. Du Bois ended the Philadelphia Negro with a statement asserting that the main problem from African Americans in 1899 was not poverty or crime or illness or unemployment. He insisted that the main problem for Black Americans was how they were being perceived by others, and that how they were being perceived effectively created, then exacerbated those problems of crime, poverty, illness, and unemployment. Thus, Du Bois saw his demographic project as foundational to correcting racial inequities across the country. So in closing, I like to think of this work as more than just a scholarly inquiry into the work of a robust intellectual, but also as a step towards a goal of enabling spatial justice, which is also a racial justice, in part by extending the historical record on the history of urban data analysis. In both quantifying and qualifying the spatial presence of Black people in the United States, Du Bois's visualization of Black life in America attempted to push back against the erasure of Blackness by asserting in his own way that Black spaces matter. because we are generally lacking historical grounding for the development of demographic data as it relates to space more generally, we are left without a clear context or historical precedent for how we do urban analytics today. In providing a fuller picture of the history of urban data analysis, I hope to be contributing to a new understanding of the present state of urban analytics by showing how data visualization and storytelling are not neutral forms of communication. Understanding Du Bois's efforts to present a more fuller rendering of Black life through the visualization of Black social life and spatial life can shed new light then on current debates regarding the scientific worthiness of data visualization and analysis. Thank you.
That's great. We have a question from a student asking if the images in the maps are intending to show the Black community in counties not dominated by the white community. That's one question. And then the second part is an empowering tool. So
The second part was what? I'm sorry.
Are the maps that you're showing, are they intended to work as a tool of empowerment or instrument?
Okay, so to the first question, he sometimes was showing, for many of these maps, there are Blacks and whites in the communities, and he's just mapping Black people, right? So for the maps where it seems like they're very dense, so for instance, some of the Philadelphia maps are quite dense in terms of the number of people in them. There were sometimes also white people living in those areas. So that's one thing actually we don't get to see in the maps themselves, although he talks about it, or some of this information is relayed in some of the charts in the Philadelphia Negro, because that was one of the things that was surprising, probably not for Du Bois, but for other people who sort of looking at the study, was that these neighborhoods were not as strictly segregated as was believed. So the question of empowerment, I find to be a complicated one in many ways. And I think it might be more about the way that that word has been used a lot of time. And I think that the word empowerment is often given way more power than it actually has. So I like to think of the maps, the kinds of maps that Du Bois created, the mapping that I'm engaging in, the mapping that I see others engage in that are sort of along these similar lines, as modes of revealing, as attributing knowledge to where knowledge should be attributed, as means of prompting discussion and allowing us to ask questions. And perhaps these are all modes or forms of empowerment, but I think I sort of prefer to break it down into the specifics rather than answering yes or no to a question of empowerment.
That's great. I posted a desire for more questions. I have maybe an observation. It seems to me by sharing these careful maps of W.E.B. Du Bois with us, there's a kind of project where you're building your intellectual ancestry by sharing and restoring, in 2020, the importance of those maps and that record, but also because we're visual thinkers who are generally drawn to the design professions, design fields, we get to think, why did he make that spiral, red? Why was the spiral red, not purple? And then why did you make your county census purple and blue? And it starts making me think of the questions that each of the intellectuals is asking and framing, and then some really small decisions which may not be anything but, I really like that color, or I like the contrast between those colors, and I think it'll be visible, and I think it's a very interesting project to make us get inside the mind of W.E.B. and imagine, why is freedom red? But it's clearly not white, but it's interesting to me that there are these choices.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly an important part of the framing that I'm bringing to this work. Since these renderings were kind of first surfaced a few years ago, there's like multiple people that have been working on them. But the approach that I'm particularly interested in is one around design, which is not a way that they've really been analyzed so far, right? Which is how I became very much interested looking at the drawings and especially the use of the curve as I sort of described, right? These, not just the choices that are being made around sort of color, but really, or any other kind of elements of it, but really understanding how design and this certain decisions about how to visually convey information become very critical to making the argument that he's trying to make, right? That there's sort of a clear visual argument being made here. And it stands out very strongly in relation to the material at hand, but I think this is an aspect of maps and mapping and data analysis that not only that we might take for granted now, but I think in some ways has fallen out a bit, right? And that we sort of approach this material too much as being representative of some truth, rather than as an opportunity to make an argument and craft a narrative around a certain set of issues.
Right. There's a question Michael Chaucer had. Michael, can you ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if, so as we're, around the world reading different forms of data representation, whether it's maps or surveys or what have you, infographics, what are some good questions to be asking ourselves when trying to identify the potential biases that could be present there, and how it could be, we could be being fed data in a certain way meant to sort of skew how we look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's always a tricky one, right? Because often if we're looking at maps, we might be looking at information that we don't really know about otherwise, right? So it can be hard to ask questions for it. But I think the questions we would ask for it are the same questions that we're asking looking at any source, right? And one of the most important questions is, where's this coming from? What is the source even of the information? What are the parameters that have been used to structure the data? And then paying attention to things like whether we're looking at data that is about space, data that is about people, or about some other attribute or characteristic, and understanding relationships between how data are mapped. And I'm sort of thinking about this in particular. There was a map that was kind of circulating a lot last week around the election that showed the difference between the electoral map that was based on counties versus an electoral map that's based on populations. And the maps look like inverses of one another. Technically, they're showing the same information, right? But the information is read completely differently when it's mapped to the space of the county versus mapped to actual numbers of people. And so I think just even being able to ask those questions becomes really critical. Just even asking the question of what's even being shown here, right? And what are the origins of it? What are the sources of it? And what kinds of parameters or frameworks are being used to link that information to the map in which it's contained?
So we have two questions. Octavia is first, and then Michael Hayes.
Okay, I had a couple of questions, just understanding like my own personal history of my family and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if of Du Bois, he considered the fact that through slavery, these Black Americans were, required to learn English. So that may have been a factor of why they were more literate. And then also I was wondering if he considered the fact that Black American communities that started manifesting in like the Midwest and the South that were solely just African American and the diversity of America. Because I understand that pictorial study, it also includes a lot of like Indians, from India and like other countries as well. It doesn't just talk about the difference between Black and white. So was that representative in his analysis and his diagrams that he presented?
Yeah, so I don't have any direct evidence of this, but I feel like I can say with pretty good confidence that Du Bois was certainly aware of all of that. But he's presenting to an audience that is far, far less knowledgeable than he is, and far less knowledgeable, not just than he is, but then that he's presenting to an audience that has almost no contact with, I would say, no real meaningful personal contact with Black people outside of a really highly racialized context, right? So even just making the point that there is literacy among Black Americans, regardless of what the origin of that literacy is, was kind of a huge leap to make in 1900 and 1903, right? So these kinds of complexities that you're talking about are absolutely true, and I'm sure he's aware of it. They don't even make it into the visualization because the visualizations are just setting just a very basic groundwork, which is really about just establishing the humanity of African Americans in a very basic way, right? But exactly what you're talking about, these are sort of the additional layers of information that we can pull out of it. And I think exactly the way you phrased that is like a good example of the kinds of questions that we can like begin to ask of these maps and visualizations when we're faced with them.
Michael, your microphone is off somehow, although you're unmuted.
Oh,
Now we hear
sorry.
you. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I've just never done Zoom on the phone before. No, Jay, I was thinking Adrienne Brown, who also worked on Du Bois, but she was looking at, in her book on the Black skyscraper, she was looking at Du Bois writing short stories and novels, but never published, that had Black characters in relationship to the skyscrapers in Chicago and New York, right at the same time as those data visualizations you were showing. She has Black characters in a very aspirational way, using the using the skyscraper, because it hasn't yet been, as it were, colonized by Europe. It was a purely American architectural form. And Adrienne Brown's point, or the way she reads Du Bois, is a highly aspirational narrative of Blackness using the skyscraper in a social, symbolic, aspirational way. And you too use the word narrative, and I think there's something about the convergence of those two. And I think partly, by the way, I think I'm following on Karen's point that because the visual realm and even the architectural realm, in Adrienne Brown's case, becomes a mediator and helps to construct the narrative. And through that, you make aspirational narratives rather than just sort of laments and indictments about how bad the system is, which of course it is. But I think at the turn of the century, the Black community could still find these narratives and find itself, as Du Bois pointed out, could find itself in a more aspirational way than in a completely oppressed way. And I think Karen's point is important, that the visual becomes a mediating device in constructing these narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the narrative structure is really important and really critical to what Du Bois is doing. I don't have like evidence for this, but I like to sort of think of it in his, not just in his training in sociology, but his roots in history, right? I mean, which you can really see in books like the Black Reconstruction and in The Souls of Black Folk especially, which is this sort of cultural narrative that is part sort of the history of racial oppression, part the sort of cultural narrative of African Americans, and also this really rigorous theory about that's about race, right? He's like articulating this kind of first racial history. But the narrative structure, I think I always relate to his link to sort of history and kind of situating Black cultural experience within the sort of broader historical narrative. And then I think exactly like you're saying, Michael, constructing it as a sort of aspirational narrative, exactly the ways in which white European histories are also constructed as aspirational narratives, right? So in that way, he's not even, I don't think, necessarily creating this aspiration as something that's counter to or distinct to solely distinct to the typical narratives around African Americans, but he's working within a process that's kind of common to his discipline, right? And reflects the things that he's writing, but it becomes a mode of resistance in some ways, or kind of a pushback against typicals, only because his narrative is about Black Americans, right? But it's very similar to, I think, the ways in which people were writing about history and sort of writing these kind of long, grand narratives of peoples and the way they kind of transformed and change over time. He's doing a similar thing. It's just that it takes on a different tone, or it has this different kind of meaning, specifically because it's about Black Americans.
Maria.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jay. That was an excellent talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm mesmerized by the drawings. Seriously, the story comes alive very much so. And you know, how you began with this idea of photographs and the classification of a social identity and of a race. And then that gets transported into, you know, these maps that begin to classify social space and still the classification of a race through the broader context that you provide, and which keep telling us the limitations that exist in this case now with respect to employment and the disparity between urban and rural occupations and the assistance, all of it. And anyway, the colors, all of it is just magical. Thank you for illuminating us. And the other point I wanted to ask is if you could please talk a little bit more about your next study in the face of climate change. A little bit more, if you have a minute.
Sure. Yeah. So this project is brand new, so it's still being developed, and so the project is about creating an interactive platform, basically, that is a collection of data regarding climate change events. Right now, we're working mostly with fire data and flood data. So we have this climate change events, we have urban form, and we have demographics. And we're sort of combining those three pillars of data to understand the relationships between them. And so I'm doing this in partnership with a colleague of mine at Northeastern, Sarah Carr. And so one of the things that we've been interested in is thinking through about, on the one hand, for many people, that climate change might not be something that is very present in their thought because they don't understand how it affects them personally. But one of the things that we do know, but kind of tangentially, because there's not a whole lot of research on this, is that climate change can have the most serious effects on people of very low income, people often in rural areas, but also in cities. And so we're interested in understanding that more specifically. So we're using racial dot data combined with climate event data to understand exactly what's happening in these places, and then ideally to be able to look at that over time. So we're in the process of building the interactive platform and pulling together the data for that, and hoping to see kind of what emerges out of that. So the data is at a national scale for the United States, so it occurs across the entire United States, but it goes down to the scale of the census block, which is the part that's exciting about it, right? So we can get this very granular data, very granular look, especially when it comes to things like flood data, for instance, which is also can occur on a more granular scale.
Great.
That's
Thank
great.
you. Keep my eye out.
Thank you. It was fantastic, Jay, and we will invite you back when you're ready to share the collaborative work with your colleagues so we can learn about climate change and race and demographics. And it sounds like you're continuing the thread that you're tugging on with W.E.B. Du Bois. So thank you so much for this. Everyone, if you could unmute for a moment your little rectangle and give a loud round of applause.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you, Jay. It was in fact the highlight of the autumn lecture series. Thanks,
Thank you so much
everybody.
for having me.
Pleasure. All right, we'll be in touch, Jay. Bye-bye.